after. And so just to give you a little background on this, a couple of evaluators had brought up, hopefully we'll go back to normal next year, but certainly wasn't normal last year, isn't normal this year. So we have, if you're in the K through 12 space, we have a void there where some of you were collecting, not collecting, but using those data in your APR or perhaps in your overall evaluation. So this is just a conversation about what you've heard other people are doing to have some kind of student academic data that can be used in place of, because the reason that we do APRs are not just so that you can evaluate how things are going, but partnering, hopefully the data you collect are also being used to make decisions and make course corrections, or right now it's just, what do we need to, you're doing lots of innovative stuff, I'm sure, in response to COVID, but what are these little changes we need to make right now that might make a difference in the student outcomes? So with that, any questions about what we're discussing or why we're here? Okay, then I'm going to open it up to you all. So the question on the table is, have you heard about anything, or have you been using anything that could be used in place of those statewide assessment data? Or do you have specific questions to the group?
So good afternoon. This is Kate from New York. If you don't mind, can you hear me? Okay, so we are grappling with this issue question and also thinking about how we can compare, contrast, utilize data where individual LEAs may be using different data collection tools. So they might be looking at data across their school or across their LEA, but what district A does to do that and the data they collect would be different, a different tool, different measurement than district B, than C, and so on and so forth. So that's another piece that we're kind of wrestling with right now in New York.
That's a good secondary, I don't know if secondary, but connected but different question. So, you want to use what people are collecting whenever possible, but at that point, how do you aggregate data? How do you compare across districts? So good. I'm glad you brought that question to us. Thank you, Kate.
Jennifer, this is Cheryl from Oklahoma. I don't know if this will help Kate, but we have a similar situation. But we have figured out a way to use a particular subset of assessments that are state required based on our third grade retention reading sufficiency legislation. Districts are required to assess their K-3 population for reading using a limited number of screeners approved by the state. We've been looking at this data for several years now. The way we look at it is we are looking for reductions in the number and percentage of students at risk based on whatever criteria a particular screener uses. And we're looking at both the populations of students on IEPs, students not on IEPs, and total students. So because the screeners are different, they do have different criteria for designating at-risk status, but we came up with using whatever, whatever criteria they use, they report based on that, and then we track it in that way. I'm not sure that would help Kate in New York, but it's worked for us. It's not the best, but it's something.
So
Cheryl,
Cheryl, oh, sorry about that. I was just going to ask Cheryl, so as I understand it, it sounds like there's a mandatory reporting time period probably for each year's tests, and there's a tool built or something, there's a input mechanism so that the data is like laying there ready for you to be able to extract it with your team and work with it as you need it to do reporting.
Well,
Is
yes and
that
no.
true? Okay.
The data is there. Getting it has been a bit of a challenge from time to time because we collect it directly from our sites through our coaches. And the state does set collection timelines for beginning of year and sometimes middle of year, depending on the year, and end of year. And so we work with our sites, when our coaches work with our sites to get that data after those time periods when they collect it. Actually, we've been surprised that this year we seem to have had more success in gathering in that data than we have had in some past years. Let me tell you, we also try to collect data on students at risk for behavior, both on IEPs and not on IEPs. That's always been the biggest challenge because sites and districts use different criteria for determining that also. And that's still a big challenge, especially since sites and districts it's been difficult to decide what is an at-risk situation in a remote learning environment. So we have that issue, but otherwise, apparently, sites report this to the state, but we have chosen to access it directly from the sites themselves.
And why did you make that decision, Cheryl?
I'm trying to think back because it's been several years. I think because that stream of data was difficult to access at the state level. I'm not sure why. I need to ask that again.
Yeah. So I'm wondering, as a follow-up question related to what Cheryl just offered from Oklahoma, and that was really helpful, do you feel like your SPDIG that you're supporting has a good knowledge of the various measures districts are currently collecting?
Yeah, there were a lot of them to begin with. There were 11 different screeners that were approved by the state. And that has come down to, I think, 8 now, 7 or 8. And the SPDIG staff and our partners at the university where our coaches come from, and also our set of literacy coaches that are contracted, especially our literacy coaches, are very well versed in each of the screeners that are being used to assess at-risk status. Some of them are new or a tweak of previous ones because there was a changing criteria for being accepted as a screener at the state last year, but they keep up with that. And yes, and they help. One of their main purposes is to help sites understand what to do with that data, how to translate that data into services for students.
Great, that's really helpful. And others on the call, do you have a good sense of what's being collected right now? I'm gonna go with K-12 language in the districts you support. Do you feel pretty knowledgeable about what's available to you?
This is Amy from California. We're currently doing an inventory of our districts to find out. We had done so previously. but we don't know which assessments are currently being used or what may have also been cut due to COVID. But we do know that all of our districts do completely different assessments, and so are likely going to be looking at improvement on whatever assessment they happen to be using, and then hopefully looking at a subgroup of districts that are all using, one assessment and trying to see if there is improvement within that assessment, whether it's, from Scholastic or Ames or whatever they happen to be doing.
So
This is, oh, go ahead.
no, it doesn't matter. This is Corinne in Virginia. Our problem with that, what I can't get around is that would require districts to submit academic data for us for not only this year, but previous years, because we have not been using the other state assessments. So if we get it for this year, how do we do any comparisons that yield to what progress has been made over the current years? That's what I'm struggling with. Is the other piece in Virginia that we're really struggling with is, as is anybody, our districts and schools are overwhelmed already. So adding in additional data collection pieces, we thought that would be easier this year if we prepared them for it, but it's turning out for our fidelity and capacity, which is not what we're talking about. We're having lower percentages this year than we ever did last year.
Hey, Mom.
Yeah, in California, we've moved away from considering doing like the pre-project, post-project comparisons because of the impact of COVID. But we are not working with all teachers in our schools or districts. So we're going to be trying to compare groups of students who are working with our teachers to those who are not. But it's going to get really messy because we are only allowed, we also collect data directly from the districts, and it needs to be de-identified data. So we are going to have to find some very helpful districts who are willing to compile that data for us. So again, it's probably going to be at a subset of districts, definitely not across all of our participants.
This is Peggy in New Jersey. Our coaches are, having some difficulty getting screening data, but are getting it from some districts. But there's also a lot of discussion going on now about state assessment, even though we don't use that for any of our reporting in the project, about administering and accountability because of all the delay in US Ed putting out anything on a waiver for that assessment. There's still discussion about it. So, but it's going to be a challenge. And we also offered in the fall a shortened version of our state assessment for districts to use to kind of direct instruction with no aggregation at a state level. So some districts use that, but many had their own assessments, but we do not collect data on those either benchmark universal screening assessments at all. Can I just ask a question? In Oklahoma, because you are collecting data on those required third grade assessments and hopefully then spurring more targeted instruction, are you seeing a drop in the number of kids at risk statewide?
I can't answer for statewide because we only work with a small subset of districts and sites with the SPDIG. We're seeing our districts and sites are just as overwhelmed with the whole remote learning environment as anyone out across the nation, I'm sure. As our data on the screeners come in, we never collected data on the actual third grade statewide assessment. But we only collected and continue to collect data on the screening that happens 3 times a year annually. But the data that we have, and the last one we've looked at was in November, is that it's about the same as we've seen in the past as far as the number and percentages of students at risk coming out, as a result of the screening. But we are still missing some data, and we hope to have that by the 1st of next month.
Thank you.
So Jennifer, this is Stephen Barr from Missouri. We have the same problems. I think Corrine probably said it best. There's no assessment available. There really isn't any capability of asking districts for additional data that's meaningful. We can collect instruments, but really trying to couple any of those together and get meaningful data would really stretch anybody's statistical capability and their honesty, actually. So, and this is not unique to the SPDIG. We've got the same thing with the SSIP data, which is heavily reliant on that, and it's essentially the same project. So we really need maybe some thoughts from the U.S. Department back to the states that says, look, here's the reality of life. We waived every state's requirement to do statewide assessments. There frankly is no viable replacement for that at this point in time. So I think we're all kind of wondering what is the practical replacement, or is it necessary to do that at this point in time? I mean, we're all going to struggle, I think, just to collect something for the following year, because that's this year's data. We're encouraging districts to do the on-site assessments, but with as many virtual schools as there are, our state assessment is not set up to do off-site at homes.
Right.
And so, I don't think it's not going to be down to zero, but it's certainly not going to be 100% of the students either. So I think we really need some thoughtful guidance from the U.S. Department at this point in time.
Yeah. And I guess I have two follow-up questions to that. One would be, what kind of guidance do you think would be sufficient? Are you talking about, assistant secretary level guidance, or secretary once we get those people in guidance, or acting of all those titles? Or is it something, if it came from a program, would be sufficient? So that's one question as you're thinking about that. The second question is, how do you know what you're doing is working?
So let me go to the first one first. I think most of these decisions do not have to be made at the highest level. So this is not like under ESSA or anything like that, where there's this high level of accountability that covers all states. For SPDIG particularly, it's unique grants. So she can cover some of hers in Oklahoma with a reading assessment that may or may not be viable for a lot of other folks. But I think this can be done at the program level. My pushback to you would be to get a consistent response from, I'm going to say, the compliance section of OSEP, because they're doing the SSIP. So if they and you can agree to it, I think we're all covered, because these are just parts of evaluating these projects.
Yeah.
For the SSIP, it's evaluating the SSIP process. For the SPDIG, it's evaluating the efficacy of the SPDIG. So we, and I'm sure all the other states, have some other types of assessments going on. We collect a lot of data on, how much time is being used, who's doing what, how much engagement is there by the districts, and a lot of other things that are going on that helps you not understand the kid outcomes necessarily, but are there at least processes happening that are likely to produce decent student outcomes. So if people are still engaged in professional development and learning that's associated with your project, you feel a little bit better than those who are not engaged. Now, I will say right away, when you look at the COVID, everybody really kind of dumbed down real fast, I think, and particularly at the end of last year. And the beginning of this year was very, very stressful for a lot of the school districts. Some of them started off, they're doing fine, having to shut down for COVID periodically, but the smaller districts, rural, they're coping relatively well. It's where you're getting into the urban arenas where there's a lot of population, and then in Missouri, it's St. Louis area, or Kansas City area, and they're making large scale decisions for the school districts in some cases that you can't have school or you can't have large collections. Much of that is washing away now, particularly I think as the new president is trying to maybe describe a different pathway, but we're already through half of the year, right? And there's not going to be anything new under the sun that we're going to have any capability of collecting, but we do have some pieces that we can rely on. I think it would be up to you guys to say to what extent do you want to trust the states to make some kind of a declaration of, we think we're okay, we think we're actually moving forward, or this is not going as well as it should, but here are the issues involved. And I think you're going to have to maybe accept some of that this year. Nobody likes it, but I don't see a practical way around it either.
Yeah. I think just to respond to your earlier comment about the SIP, the State Systemic Improvement Plan, one thing to take into consideration is that for the 2000, every grant that's not a 2020, just funded in 2020 SPDIG, there's no programmatic requirement that you would provide us with student outcome data, child outcome data. The 2020 grants do have that requirement. That said, this year they don't have to provide those data, and it's a long-term measure. So you can work up to it, and it can be, we can have a longer conversation about what that's going to look like. And so the SIP requirements are quite different than the SPDIG requirements. They might be aligned. You might be doing it. So I think it's a great idea if you have been. But it was not in the notice that you responded to, the notice of inviting applications, nor has it been, added on as a requirement over time. And so you may put it in your APR before, but that's, it's a conversation with your project officer about what you can do. And so I just want to make sure everyone was clear on that fact. Go ahead, Steve.
Yeah, I'm sure that it's not uniform, but some states, we are one of them that tied the SSIP from the very beginning into the SPDIG. So, we've had this long complementary process going on. The questions that SPDIG requires are different than the SSIP. I've always tried to say, hey, can you guys get closer to this? So I'm like writing 2 reports for the same project, and it looks like they're different alien worlds, but it's the same project. But everybody's kind of in a different situation, I'm sure, across this. But for our benefit, we'd love to have a more consistent response that would handle SPDIG and the SSIP simultaneously. But that may be just a few of the states that are like that right now.
And I was just going to follow up on what Stephen had said. Y'all, this is Jason Torres Altman, and I'm curious to hear a little bit too. I know there's a lot of I see 4 or 5 evaluators on the call right now too, and some of the ideas that have been discussed so far on the call are good ideas, but I wonder if from like a evaluation standpoint, if like putting in the amount of effort and the really kind of leveraging those relationships with the district in a way to just try to take in some amount of student level achievement data, if it's actually really worth it in the end in this interim? You know, as evaluators, would we say that any analysis that we're doing on these backup data is like scientifically defensible and sound and robust? You know, for example, if a project is working across all grade levels, K-8 or something like that, and the only data available in your state is for third grade, and it's on a variety of tests, which maybe test different constructs than your state test, which is maybe what you've been using to report in the past. You know, is it, how do folks feel? Like, is that actually scientific? Is there a reason to be doing like a substitute analysis like that? Or are you just chasing things around and spending a lot of time and resources just trying to put a number on a page that may not actually, it might not be something you'd even want to use project wide because you just don't feel like it's accurate, you know?
I mean, I agree with you, Jason. I just worry about, it's not only just the outcomes, it's the way these programs have been implemented this past year. And so I have concerns about that too. We have just the implementation varies, is pretty common, but now we really have great gaps in implementation and even in our veteran schools. So I just don't even know how, if we were going to do any sort of alternate outcomes, you'd really have to tie those to implementation. You'd have to have a really laser focus on, you know, what was being implemented. And to not even have any historical references. You know, we have no data from last year. From the spring, I'm sorry, we do have fall data, but you know, that's also a concern. There's just a huge gap in the assessments, and now we're struggling with varying levels of implementation and how assessments are being administered. I mean, it's just very messy stuff. And I'd be afraid, frankly, and I'm sure all evaluators will agree, I'd be afraid of generating outcomes that would be used out of context. And I think that's a greater problem than we might otherwise, you know, we wouldn't want this data to be used against the program in terms of future policy making. You know, I just have really big work. I know how data gets used sometimes, and it's not always with the best intentions, and sometimes just out of, you know, lack of awareness or understanding of the data that's being used. By the way, that was Shelley. Sorry, everyone. I should introduce myself. I don't even have my camera on. You probably all know my voice by now.
That's helpful. Yeah, I'm, you know, of course I'm torn, and I'm sure you feel the same way, you, the group, between, I understand everything you're talking about with the context. At the same time, you know, to at least collect something that, you know, with the caveats, this should not be used this way, this should not be used this way, this should not be used this way. But, you know, if you're giving us information about how you do professional development, you're collecting fidelity data, although that may look a little bit different, but having something about the impact of those actions that somehow shows you what you need to change, because it's still, you still want to improve what you do. You still want to be responding to the needs. And it's such a big chunk of what you need to make those decisions. Yeah. And Patty, do you want to talk about that, or do you want me to?
I don't know. I mean, it's just my thinking. So I mean, I know there are a lot of challenges to it, but I actually, as an evaluator, don't particularly love using state testing data as an outcome. We do it because for a while, that's all we had. But I think it's much better to look at short-term and intermediate outcomes directly related to the intervention that you're doing. And, you know, maybe that's teacher observed outcomes in students, or even student self-reported outcomes, or there's different ways you can go about it. But if it can be done in a more timely fashion, and then you can make decisions with it, to me, that's much more preferred. And then as a side note, this is a different project, but we've been working with some schools and have been able to get GPA data on students associated with their student numbers to be able to pair that over time. There's other things too. Anyhow, I'm interested in the screening idea. We tried that in the past and had trouble making sense of student growth with screening data because kids move between the tiers so much. And just because you become proficient doesn't mean you don't go down a tier. So anyhow, if anyone wants to talk about that on the side, I'm interested, and never truly figured out how you use several different screening measures and merge them together and show growth over time. But I don't know, that's all. Those are just my quick thoughts.
Patty, this is Cheryl. And what you said about not really liking state testing data really spoke to me, because over the many years I've been with the Oklahoma SPDIG, we have tried to look at student achievement data based on statewide testing. And it's been a nightmare, just to tell the truth, because there's been so many changes in the state's testing instrument and the grade levels tested, that one time I went to have a heart-to-heart talk with someone in the assessment office. And after he laid down all the different changes that had happened over the lifespan that I was wanting to look at, what had changed as far as the content that was tested, the grade levels that were tested, he said, I wouldn't recommend you use this. And so that's when we dropped. And we no longer look at state testing data for our impact on students. We look at what we were saying, more immediate, shorter term. It's not the best. It's messy. I agree. And I'd love to talk to you some more about it. Maybe you can give me some ideas.
Yeah, let's brainstorm at some point, because I'm with you. It's challenging, but I think if we're talking about database decision making and really wanting to know if our evidence-based practices are effective and then do something about them if they're not, we can't wait, right?
Mm-hmm. Agree.
So it has been challenging. Florida, I don't know if you want to talk, but to me, you guys have made great strides in your fidelity scoring summary for Check and Connect. So 3 times a year, I don't know, Peg, do you want to do it? I'm going to mute and let you talk.
Oh, Patty, you go ahead and talk.
Okay,
I'm not an evaluator. I'm not even supposed to be here.
They are having the coordinator who's up from the mentor 3 times a year go in and say basically to what degree the 4 parts of the intervention were provided for each student. So that's implementation. But then they're also having to say any observed outcomes. So, you know, whatever, improved attendance, more on-time homework submission. I don't remember the list, but so 3 times a year per each student, that's being reported from one removed from the person actually doing the work. So I think it's very interesting data that's compelling to look at, and lots of decisions have been made just based on that alone. Do you want to add anything, Peg? I mean, you could also talk about the SIM stuff or.
Well, I was going to say the SEI data as well. I think that we've been seeing some interesting stuff from that. So the student engagement instrument, which is a self-report from the student, and we've implemented this process where the students are asked to complete that when they enter the program of Check and Connect, and then annually afterwards. So we're just beginning to get some of that data. And then for the strategic instruction model, for both of our programs, actually, we have this expectation that the schools that we work with have school implementation teams, and those school implementation teams create goals for, you know, what they want to see happen for their students based on their implementation. And we have coordinators that are reporting we have a standardized template that they record back to our district implementation teams on a quarterly basis as well. So we're looking at it from a lot of different angles, and Florida's data rich. I mean, we have access to lots and lots of state produced reports. So at the same time, I'm pulling trend data on attendance and graduation and dropout and looking at that over the years. And we were doing the proficiency rates with the state assessment data, but obviously that's a concern right now.
So the last thing I'll add is in some other states and districts we're working with, yes, you have to go to the districts for the data, but they have been willing to share things like their DF reports. So number of kids with Ds and Fs and how many Ds and Fs at each quarter. Or especially now, I think they're keeping a close eye on these things as they're trying to, you know, catch students up and get them passing their classes. They're looking at this data a lot. And so I don't know if it's an easy share. ODRs are something else that we used to do, but not so much this year, which makes sense. But, you know, you have a lot of attendance issues with the virtual education stuff. I don't know. I'm going to be quiet now.
No, but I'm really glad you spoke up, Patty, because, you know, I think it's our job, especially because, again, the SPDIG is different than the SIP in that we have the ability to, you know, with your project measures, they're not the same as the program measures. They're not, it's really a way for you to tell your story to us. And generally when you have student outcomes, they're going to be your project measures right now. And so it's a way to tell your story to us, a way to tell your story to yourself, maybe in your state, but with caveats, you still want to be painting the picture of why you're doing your work, how it's making a difference. And you, again, like we were saying, this is database decision making. So how are you making your decisions if you don't have any data? And so I think if we can keep in mind a more, what do we have available to us? How can we use it? Caveat the heck out of it if you need to, but at least help yourself to paint a picture, help yourself to make decisions based on the data, and help others be able to tell your story about why it still makes sense to have a SPDIG even in COVID.
So I don't know if any of you guys have advice too on how you ask schools for data, but we have learned to be very specific on the data that we're asking for, and that we want it by student number. If we want, you know, ethnicity with it, we ask it for it in Excel for a specific quarter. And that, I think, is much easier. If you can be super clear on what you want, they can pull it, arrange it, and give it to you in a form then you can use, as opposed to saying more broadly, what data do you have related to attendance? Can we have it? But they don't do as well with that. So that's just one quick thought of how we've been more successful.
So I heard one thing so far that I can, well, a couple things I can follow up on. One was trying to ensure that we're more aligned with the SIP reporting requirements. Two was potentially having some kind of letter of support for you all from the SPDIG program. I'd be interested in hearing what you all thought might be useful. Is this just, you know, would work in Missouri but might not work elsewhere? Is it something that needs to be program wide, or maybe a project officer could work on it? So if you all think that would be useful, you can tell me now. You can email me about what that letter might contain, and then I could start going through, if it's a program letter, then I could start going through that, because we do work with our Office of General Counsel on something like that. So it takes a little back and forth, and I'd want to get it going now. Okay, what else might be helpful from other evaluators or from someone outside of SIG Network or from the department? What else might be helpful to you all right now?
Jennifer,
Mm-hmm.
I ask about the guidance for the
Mhm.
APR that you're planning. Usually next month we start with a webinar. Could you just
Mhm.
tell us what you're planning for that?
Yeah, absolutely. Can you see my screen?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So during the normal directors webinar, what I'll do is I'll talk about this year's APR. I think it depends on, I'm not sure how much I'll be able to get through. And so I think I'm going to have a separate session for new grantees or just anyone who needs to be refreshed a little bit on the overall process. But I'm generally going to focus on what this year looks like for the APR. And some of you have already heard this before or have actually seen this, because I floated this by some evaluators to get their take on it. But this is guidance about this year's flexibilities. So you see it's the school year 2020, 2021. And so for the project measures, I just talked about this, of course, right? I just talked about this a little bit, that this is a year that we need innovation and flexibility, and you get to work with your project officer to ensure that you can get the most flexibility and that you're aware of what will work. So I'm your project officer for some of you I am not. So you talk to your project officer. The overall program measure guidance, it kind of just reminds people. I'm going to go to a plugin source hopefully in a moment. But it just reminds people of what is available to you program measure wise. And so there are some pages, some guidance pages for each of the measures if you need that. But program measure 1, there really won't be any changes except for how you did professional development will look different, but the components that you are responding to remain the same. It's just that when you're doing it virtually, you're just going to be describing what that looked like. You're just reporting what is on that. So there really shouldn't be any changes, and this explains that. We also provided, with the feedback of the evaluators, provided some different just technical assistance resources that might be helpful. So designing professional development in a remote learning environment, here for program measure 1. For program measure 2, with the fidelity measurement, we realize that will probably look quite different this year. That is okay. Again, fidelity, the important thing is that
Oh no, it looks like we potentially lost Jennifer.
I guess
We
her
have
computer
all been there.
died.
Yeah, yeah.
Jennifer, where are you?
If,
Was that a coup, Jason?
yeah, I'm not sure what that was. I'm wondering if Len, you're still on the call. Can you pick it up from where she was at? I don't know if any of the rest of us can help
No.
too much.
I'm reasonably good at Zoom, but I'm terrible at what you all are talking about. I had a news feed earlier today that the internet was suffering major droppages from DC to Boston along the eastern seaboard. So I don't know if this affected her, Jennifer, or not. Which is to say, I can't tell you whether she'll be able to get back on or not.
I don't know, have most everybody seen that guidance document that Jennifer was showing? I didn't know how widely she distributed it yet. But I must say, I think it looks really helpful, especially because Jason recommended that she put on it links to sessions and webinars that were directly related to a particular performance measure. And I think that really helps us in putting all that in one place, right, Jason?
I hope so. And thanks, Len, that you probably ended up doing some of that work,
Yeah.
finding all those links and finding the locations. But yeah, it seemed like there were a lot of instances in trying to just read through that document and the guidance where, you know, there'd be a statement that was like, oh yeah, we have a great example of this, but like we could just easily hyperlink that statement in that document to something that would give you a little deeper amount of information anyways, or see what some other state was suggested they were doing. So I'm glad that it looks the way it looks. I think it'll be very helpful.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Jason. Sorry.
Hey, you're back.
Oh, you're back.
I'm so sorry. I think giving someone more than 2 minutes of knowing you have a low battery would be appropriate. I don't have sufficient time. All right, let me go ahead and share my screen. I'm so sorry about that. Okay. So let's go here. So program measure 2, improving implementation. Again, that's going to look quite different. There is a recorded resource from New Hampshire. It's just 30 minutes long. They did it in a 15+15 presentation style. Some of you know what that is. So they were just sharing basically what they're doing, and you had some time to discuss with them. But they have been very responsive to the changing context, and they used to have observation for fidelity, and now they've made it a self-assessment. And they found in the process that the teams doing the self-assessment, especially the leader, has really learned from that process and had a deeper understanding of what they're implementing. You know, what is this system? And so that was nice to watch. The 20% check. So this is, if it's a self-assessment, you do not have to have an outside person do a reliability check. So that's been waived for the year. Any questions about program measure 1 or 2 so far? Right, and then these are resources related to that. So Karen Ward and Sophia Farmer from CSEP TI Center talk about implementation capacity, system fidelity, practice fidelity, and what this all means for virtual data collection. There's also Shelley, who's on the line here. We have her recording and slide presentation about how she puts together the Iowa SPDIG spotlights. And she makes really good use of fidelity data. And then there are also child outcome data that are connected to that, and as well as the professional development that's being provided. So for program measure 3, this is your cost measure. And of course, for program measure 2 and 3, you set your own target. And so hopefully at the beginning of this APR year, I guess you could call it, hopefully you rethought your targets, considering what it was going to look like. You know, I know no one knew exactly how things, I totally understand that. But anyway, so you set your own target for these, and then you collect the data about how you did against the target. And for program measure 3, the data are actually your spending. So it's dollars. And it's about, after initial training, what are you doing to support full implementation, support sustained implementation? And often this is in the form of coaching or mentoring or helping to use data, that kind of thing. Program measure 4 is only 3 grants that collect that, so we're not going to talk about that right now. And then again, program measure 5, that's new, and that is only for grantees who first received their grant in fiscal year 2020. And it's not, the data are not due this year. So I think we'll end up talking about that more in depth with the new grantees. So questions about this guidance document or anything related to the APA this year? Okay.
Jennifer?
Yes.
Sorry. For program measure 5, you talk about collecting baseline data. If you're using something like graduation rates, right? Baseline data won't be available in March. It would be available for the next year's APR. Is that going to be a particular issue or something?
No, that's not going to be, I mean, again, you always do also need to work with your project officer, but I think that the important part is that we will have conversations about it. We know that it's not just an easy answer right now when you'll have data available, and it's a long-term measure. So that means that you will be giving us data in the meantime, but it's really about what you're able to achieve in the fullness of your.
Sure.
Other questions? Okay, well, thanks so much for a good conversation today. Again, let me know what we can do to support you. Give me feedback at your convenience about whether a letter would be helpful. I can't see anything that was chatted while I was gone, but it was only a couple minutes. But you can either put in the chat pod right now, or you can email me if you think a letter might be supportive of your data collection currently. And thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Thanks, Jen.